Well, thank you very much, everyone, for attending here. Today's announcement by the federal government exposes the Trudeau carbon tax for the sham that it is. We already know that it's not good environmental policy. We already know that it's not good economic policy. And today, we learned what it actually is. It's a cynical attempt by the Trudeau government to buy your vote with your money. There's just a tiny bit of good news in today's announcement. Just this morning, we learned that the federal government has accepted our Prairie Resilience Climate Change Plan here in Saskatchewan. They have recognized that this is a strong, achievable plan that is based in reality, and it's based in real emissions reductions. Unfortunately, while some other provinces are being exempted from the Trudeau carbon tax based on partial compliance, they are still going ahead with the portion of the carbon tax that hits Saskatchewan families the hardest. By imposing their carbon tax at the pumps, by imposing their carbon tax on electricity and natural gas, which will mean higher Sask Power and Sask Energy bills for Saskatchewan families. Even though Sask Power also has put forward a very meaningful plan to reduce emissions without a carbon tax. Here in Saskatchewan, the Trudeau tax scheme amounts to a financial shell game, where people will be charged more to fill up their vehicles. They will be charged more when they pay for their Sask Power and their Sask Energy bills to heat their homes. With some of that money that is being returned in the form of a rebate. And again, our province asks, if this is the case, what's the point? Instead of taking your money and giving some of it back, why not just let Saskatchewan families keep their money? I don't accept that Saskatchewan families will be better off. This is Saskatchewan. Most of us have to drive a lot. We drive to work, we drive for our kids' recreation and their school, and we have to heat our homes on some very cold days in this province. And this is all going to cost a whole lot more now. That is just the direct costs. What about the carbon taxes that others now will have to pay that will be passed along to your family? Hockey rinks, school divisions, our schools, municipalities, they are all going to be paying a carbon tax, and that is a cost that will be passed along, as I said, to your family. This appears to be more of a political decision than an environmental one. Saskatchewan will continue to fight the carbon tax and this new Liberal vote-buying scheme. Our constitutional court challenge continues. We believe the entire federal carbon tax scheme is unconstitutional, and specifically, we believe that the federal government has no right to apply its carbon tax to Sask Power and Sask Energy, both Saskatchewan Crown utilities, as one level of government cannot tax another level of government. Today, we are repeating our call for the federal government to respect this legal challenge and hold off on imposing the carbon tax in Saskatchewan, at least until the constitutional challenge has been heard and has been decided. The Trudeau carbon tax is bad environmental policy. The Trudeau carbon tax is bad economic policy. And today's announcement, we see it as a cynical vote-buying scheme using your money to buy your vote. Your Saskatchewan Party government will continue to reject this carbon tax scheme, and your Saskatchewan government will continue to stand up for Saskatchewan families. So thank you. If there's any questions, we'd be happy to take them.
I don't know if I understand your argument, because you're saying, on one hand, that they're attempting to buy votes here, and on the other hand, you're saying it's going to cost families. Which one is it?
We don't agree with the federal government that this will actually be beneficial for families in the province of Saskatchewan. Why wouldn't we just leave it the way it is? Why would we leave the dollars in the Saskatchewan families' pockets? Why would you charge it just in an attempt to give it back? How this will essentially cost families is there is still a tax that is on, for instance, on our agricultural producers in the case of buying gas to dry their grain in a year like this year. Buying when they ship their products on a train, there is still going to be a carbon tax on the fuel used by that industry. When they load that product on a truck out of their yard, there is going to be a carbon tax on that fuel. This is not a farmer-friendly tax by any stretch in this province, and it will continue to affect the economy and the jobs that we have in Saskatchewan.
How do you say that the carbon tax will take money out of the pockets of Saskatchewan residents. But your PST does the same thing. So how is the PST good and the carbon tax not good?
Well, I think ultimately, at the end of the day, we'd like to live in an environment where we have no taxes, so to speak. The carbon tax that we have, that is being suggested, we don't have, that is being suggested by the federal government, will essentially pressure the competitive environment that we have in Saskatchewan that is already experiencing many pressures in the way of natural resource prices, in the way of access to our ports and access to our markets with the lack of pipelines, and we see the oil differential that we're faced with here today. We have many pressures on Saskatchewan products, and a carbon taxation scheme from the federal government, even in its current form that is put forward here today, that we learned of as the Prime Minister raised to his feet to announce this in Ontario, is still detrimental to the industries in our province. Do you have anything to add to that, Minister of Environment?
Yeah, I would just say that, keep in mind, the federal government have justified all of this by saying that this is good for the environment. And what the U of R study shows is that this actually won't reduce emissions in Saskatchewan, based on the way that our economy functions, based on the fact that 48% of our GDP is based on exporting products around the world. That's the highest proportion out of any province in Canada. So what that study shows is that this actually won't reduce emissions. So if the federal government says that we need a carbon tax to reduce emissions, this won't do it. We're pleased that they recognize Prairie Resilience is an actual plan that will reduce emissions. The carbon tax won't.
I'm just saying, how is it okay for you guys to raise PST and really take from people in this province and then say, well, hey, wait a second, feds, you guys can't do that.
But
how is that? How do you reconcile that?
because you're talking about two different things. But what's the purpose? Governments will collect taxes to provide services to the citizens. So that's what we do. We have income tax, we have corporate tax, we have sales tax to provide services. The federal government says that they want to add a carbon tax, not to provide for services, but to help the environment, to reduce emissions. And our argument is that's actually a false premise, because for Saskatchewan, certainly, a carbon tax will not reduce emissions.
Can just that you've over your SAS Power hat on for a second.
Yeah.
Since Minister Goodell was saying that the output-based performance standards are going to be applied to electricity generation as well as natural gas pipelines. Has there been any modeling on what that could mean for rates in the province?
Absolutely. So for SAS Power, by 2022, it's an additional just over $900 million.
What does that look like on a per household basis?
I would say we're looking at several different scenarios, but for 2019, in a year where we have announced that there will not be a SAS Power rate increase required, we'll need an additional approximately $141 million in 2019, which could work out to about a 6% increase.
Minister Goodell said today that climate change is costing the provincial and federal government in the billions of dollars. That's part of the reason for this plan. What's your response to that?
This does nothing to address that, because a carbon tax won't actually reduce emissions in Saskatchewan. The U of R study shows that it'll reduce less than 1 million tons of carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere by 2030. It'll cause about $16 billion worth of reduction in our GDP. And so what we've always said is that we need to focus on more than just a single policy approach than just a carbon tax. That's the whole point of Prairie Resilience. So it looks at our heavy emitters, but it also looks at ensuring that how are we resilient to the continuing changes of climate change, because we are only 1.6% of global emissions. And so even if we reduce our emissions to zero in Saskatchewan today, global climate change will continue. So we need to prepare our communities to be resilient to the changes of climate change. A carbon tax doesn't change that at all.
I think that's acknowledged today as well by the acceptance of the Prairie Resilience Plan, that it is a plan that is based in fact, and it is a plan that is based in actual emissions reductions. And what we see with the federal backstop being applied to families across the province at the fuel pumps and on their heating bills is essentially the portion of the tax that we most certainly made a choice not to move forward on, because of the impact it would have on families, and because it would actually not have an impact on the environment in any way, shape, or form. And that's why we will continue our constitutional legal challenge on this basis. want to speak to that a
Yeah,
little bit.
our goal has to be to reduce emissions. There's no doubt that's the direction we need to go. We don't think a tax is the appropriate way to do that. We don't think it's going to have the effect of reducing emissions. And calling it a pollution pricing system or any other name, a tax is simply a tax. And what we don't believe the federal government has the right to do is to tax differently in different provinces and say this province is going to have this price increase on fuel, this one's going to be differently. So what we've asked the federal government to do and continue to ask them to do is wait until there's clarity from the courts, not just the Court of Appeal in Saskatchewan or the Court of Appeal in Ontario, but wait until the Supreme Court has rendered a final decisions, then Canadians know and have the certainty as to where the jurisdiction is or is not for this type of thing. And in the meantime, we'd like to sit and work with the federal government to continue to reduce emissions in the meantime. But to impose a tax that we think is unconstitutional and illegal is just not something that should be done in our province and in our country.
Mr. Morgan, you heard a specific date for when the Court of Appeal is going to hear this case?
We don't have a specific dates. We know that we're into the spring, and it will take some time afterwards, and we have no control over what timeline it would take for the Court of Appeal to render a decision. There's every likelihood that it would go from the Court of Appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada. So we're probably a year or more out before we get a final decision. We know that the Ontario process has started as well. We are an intervener in that action as they are in ours, and ultimately, I suspect the Court of Appeal or the Supreme Court will want to hear all of the applications together.
To clarify, Mr. Morgan, do you reject the notion that pollution is a product, and therefore would be taxed similar to a tie or a watch?
We think that there's no doubt the federal government has the right to levy a tax. What they don't have the right to do is to pick and choose which provinces get a tax levied on them. We say, we like this plan, so we're going to levy a smaller tax here. We don't like what this province has done. So they don't have the right to pick and choose. That's the argument that we're advancing, and we think that argument is sound. We don't think that Canadians in different provinces or different jurisdictions should be taxed differently as a result of the federal government.
If it's a uniform tax, then they have a jurisdiction in environmental.
It would be, if they chose to do, we would look at it. But right now, they haven't chosen to do that, and we saw what came out today, and it's nowhere close to any kind of a uniform tax. What it is it's singling out individual provinces and saying, we like this, we don't like that, and are imposing it on. And Saskatchewan is the one that has done a lot of things otherwise. We are a huge carbon sink because of the trees, the crops that are grown here, the things that we've done already. So from a legal point of view, we think that those things should be recognized, should be taken into account. But from a pure taxation point of view, this is a tax, and it's wrong to have a tax differently in one province than the other. It would be the same as if they said to us, oh, well, the GST is going to be different. In Ontario, it's going to be 1% rate and a different rate in Saskatchewan, which is simply something that should be unacceptable to all Canadians.
I guess in terms of
Ask about the, I guess the gas, and one of the numbers was that 4.42 liter jump in April 2019. How do you expect that, or what's your opinion, how that will affect the energy industry here and I guess consumer pricing as well?
Well, I would just say again to Minister Duncan's comments that it simply isn't a number that will work in any way in reducing emissions in any way, shape, or form. There was a study that the Prime Minister had referenced recently done by the United Nations that had said this should actually go as high as $5,500 a ton, which I think is about $16 or $17 a liter of gas. So it doesn't have any environmental outcomes or targets, or will it reduce emissions in any way, shape, or form in its current form. It'll cost the people in this province money, and families in this province money. And so we had left it out of our plan on purpose. We had left it out of our plan because of the damage that it would provide, the consequences that it would have with Saskatchewan families.
I'll just.
The study you just cited was the UN report where in there scientists and economists said the carbon pricing is a way to reduce emissions. And I know the minister said that the U of R study doesn't say that has any effect, but there are obviously studies out there widespread that say this will impact the environment. And in your plan, the Prairie Resiliency Plan, one of the criticisms of the minister, federal minister, was that there was nothing to change behaviors in that plan initially. Like if my gas goes up, I might not drive as much. Or I guess, how is that not?
So with respect to the study that is IPCC study? Is the IPCC study. And with that study, they had said that a carbon tax would work if everyone in the world participated in it, which isn't going to happen. The United States is not participating, China is not participating, India is not participating. So everyone is not participating, first and foremost. Second, they had said by 2030, the carbon tax would have to be as high as $5,500 a ton. That is not going to happen, to my knowledge, anywhere in the nation of Canada, hopefully, or anywhere around the world. So that study will not be complied with the terms that they say that a carbon tax would actually be an effective tool. What we see today is the federal government actually acknowledging the Plan of Prairie Resilience as being an effective tool, as adopting it with, and we feel that is the adoption that should happen, as it is a result that, as Minister Morgan put, recognizes the work that our industries have done here in the province over the last number of years, recognizes the work that is actually possible and achievable into the future between now and 2030 and beyond, and is a plan that is supported by most of industry here in the province. It's a plan with real results, and that's been acknowledged by the federal government here today. We didn't choose to move forward with taxing families for heating their homes and taking their kids to hockey rinks and to school. That was a purposeful choice on our part, and we feel that we can make real reductions in our Plan of Prairie Resilience without going into families' pockets.
I would just add to that. I think that there's a couple of things to keep in mind. So the federal assumptions are all based on households in Canada, including Saskatchewan, having one vehicle per household. But in Saskatchewan, we have 1.7 vehicles per household. So the assumptions are, we think there's a problem with the assumptions that the federal government's using. And I think, as the Premier indicated, even the federal government's own highly redacted documents indicate that a $50 per ton is not high enough to actually change behavior. And if the federal government is going to send back all the dollars that you're going to pay in a carbon tax to you, then why do it in the first place? What's the incentive for me to change my behavior? If I can change my behavior, in Saskatchewan, as the Premier's indicated, we have to travel a lot. We're a relatively small population base spread over a very large land base. Our economy is set up different. We are an export-based economy. So transportation is just a way of life in Saskatchewan. We don't have that many options. And so if we're just going to send back, if the federal government's going to send back the dollars that they're collecting from you as an individual or you as a household, what's the incentive to change your behavior? And again, their own documents say that the numbers aren't even high enough at $50. And that's been a part of our argument as well with other provinces. If we allow, as provinces, the federal government to impose a carbon tax, they can say it'll stop at $50 by 2022. But what's to stop them from going even higher?
We're just going to go to the question from the back from Ryan.
I know that you had called this a sham by the federal government. People in Saskatchewan or a family of four will get at least $200 more in their pockets than they did. Do you not feel as though people in Saskatchewan will enjoy having more money in their pocket on an annual basis now?
I actually don't agree with that formula. As Minister Duncan had indicated, the Saskatchewan, this whole repayment scheme is based on, for example, one vehicle per household. In Saskatchewan, we average 1.7 vehicles per household. We have farmyards across the province that are still going to have to, under the federal government's intent, have to pay on a carbon tax not only on their home, but on their shop and any other outbuildings that they may have. The model that they are using for across Canada assumptions is not relative in many ways to what we find here in this province. That is why First Ministers agreed to the Vancouver Declaration in the first place when we started this conversation, prior to the imposition across Canada of a carbon tax by the Prime Minister. The First Ministers at that point in time agreed that they would work within their jurisdictions to do what they could to ensure that Canada would be able to meet our reductions as committed to in the Paris Accord. We signed that document. That's the last document that we've signed with the federal government on this. We do expect, however, in light of the 4 provinces that have been singled out in compliance or partial compliance, to be receiving our low carbon economy fund and be treated equitably with those other 4 provinces that are experiencing a portion of the backstop being imposed on them. And if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I had a quick look at Minister Goodale's comments from earlier this morning, and there's just areas where he's just factually incorrect. He indicated that 4 provinces have chosen not to participate in the federal plan, but they'll all be treated equitably when it comes to the low carbon economy fund. That's not the case. Manitoba, even though the plan will be imposed on Manitoba, Manitoba is still going to get low carbon economy dollars. Every other province that is either partially in compliance or not is still going to get low carbon economy dollars except for Saskatchewan. So Ralph Goodale is in
Minister, he committed to giving you that money today.
He did.
directly to the province?
He said
Well, that, okay, so here's to a little bit of the frustration. Great. Well, that's the first we've ever heard of that. In fact, the first we ever heard of what the federal government was going to be announcing today was 5 minutes after the Prime Minister stood up in Toronto, is when the Deputy Minister of Environment for Canada phoned our Deputy Minister here in Saskatchewan. So that's the first we've ever heard of that. And I think it just points to a growing frustration with this entire file. The Prime Minister stood up today in Toronto and announced that Saskatchewan was with a number of provinces that were not in compliance. And he singled out Saskatchewan that we were not in compliance with what the federal government would like to see. And yet their own documents actually acknowledge the work of Prairie Resilience. And they acknowledge that Saskatchewan actually has a very good plan when it comes to heavy emitters, and therefore the heavy emitter portion of the federal plan would not be imposed on the province. Why didn't he say that? Why did he just single out Saskatchewan as we're offside on this, when actually his own documents and what the Deputy Minister indicated 5 minutes after the Prime Minister stood up was that actually Saskatchewan, in this respect, has a very good plan.
Saskatchewan saw their Power bills increase significantly to reduce emissions through the Boundary Dam capture project, and we didn't end up with any dollars in our pockets extra after that process and those consistent increases. How is this any different, where we're again going to see Power increases on our monthly bills, but we're also going to be seeing more money in our pockets at the end?
The first difference is this, is that Boundary Dam 3 actually did decrease emissions. The carbon tax will not.
So here's what I think everybody in Saskatchewan should understand about what the federal government is doing. They are stacking policy upon policy upon policy, which they perhaps don't understand the consequences of that. So we already are regulated in terms of how electricity is generated in this province. It's the coal-fired electricity generation regulations. And because of those regulations, we're going to change our generation plan over the coming years to see a 40% reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions, in part by moving to 50% renewables by 2030. The carbon tax imposed on Power will not change one iota of the way that Power is going to reduce emissions. So this stacking on top of what we already have in terms of regulations is not going to change Power in terms of how they're going to achieve their emissions reductions. So we're already going to see at a minimum a 40% reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions, which goes over and above the 30% that Canada signed on to. And yet Power is going to have to essentially pass this on to their customers, which is not going to change the way that electricity is generated. And frankly, I don't think it's going to change the behavior of Saskatchewan residents if they're going to get their money back.
So you're totally rejecting the federal documents. I believe they say that the Prairie Resilience Plan, and including the measures that the federal government's going to impose here, will capture 60% of provincial emissions.
But it's already captured. We're already capturing the emissions from electricity. So when you factor in our heavy emitters, which the federal government actually, the Prime Minister won't admit this publicly, but the federal government has acknowledged and are accepting our plan. So they think that that's good work, obviously.
And our plan
Okay.
is the only piece of moving forward that will actually reduce emissions here in the province. A carbon tax has no targets, has not proven to reduce emissions anywhere in this nation or around the world on its own. It's the Prairie Resilience Plan that actually puts forward reduction targets, actually puts forward a plan on how we will achieve those targets. Our carbon tax does none of that.
We already admitted that we were at 60% of our economy through our methane action plan, which is going to see a 40 to 45% reduction in methane emissions, in our electricity plan, which is going to see a 40% reduction in electricity emissions, and which was going to see our heavy emitters being regulated and actually see real emissions reductions. Where we disagreed was on basically the two remaining points. The large one is fuels, because the nature of our economy, the way people actually live in Saskatchewan, that it was only going to harm Saskatchewan and not actually achieve emissions reductions, which the federal government continues to say this is what it's all about, which I question highly. The other point, too, that Ralph Goodale, I think, is incorrect on is he said that today that farm fuel is exempt. Or he said that farmers are exempt from this plan, correct?
Yeah.
I wasn't there.
Fuels and farm trucks and machinery.
Okay. He's talking only about farm fuel. That doesn't include if I have to hire somebody to haul my grain, that grain hauler is going to pay fuel tax, is going to pay carbon tax on his fuel, which he's going to pass on to me. That doesn't include the railroads that are going to pay a carbon tax and pass it on to the farmer. It does include fertilizer production and transportation, which the fertilizer companies are going to pass that on to the farmer. And it doesn't include the cost of natural gas to dry my grain, especially in a year like this year when we have a lot of farmers that still have crops out and need to dry their grain. So to me, it just shows that Ralph Goodale is divorced from the economic reality of Saskatchewan and from how farming actually operates in Saskatchewan. It's scary to think that that is our federal government representative, our sole federal government representative in Ottawa, explaining to Ottawa how farming works, because he clearly doesn't understand.
Couple last questions here.
Any thoughts on the session, if I could, whenever you want to get to that, unless there's more carbon tax.
No, we're looking forward to the opening of the legislature here tomorrow, I guess, is when we will have our speech from the throne. We're looking forward to discussions throughout the legislative session with respect to achieving our 3-year plan, the balance in this legislative session, with the budget being a balanced budget being announced this coming spring. We're looking forward to more discussion about the economic opportunities that we have as we move forward, that we are talking about here today in many ways as well, and how this government will continue to stand with the industries and the families and the jobs across this great province that we have the opportunity to represent. We'll be talking about our plan of prairie resilience here in the province as well, and how that plan came about through the consultation of industries and ensuring that we can achieve emissions reductions to do better by our environment and do better by our next generation without sending those jobs and causing those jobs to actually move to other areas of the world that don't have a carbon taxation policy in place. So we look forward to this legislative session. We also look forward to having the discussion with respect to how we can continue to move forward with investment in our communities and with the services that people across this province expect their provincial government to be providing in their communities, investments in healthcare and education and post-secondary education, and investments in ensuring that we can continue to support and give a hand up to our communities most vulnerable.
Sort of an ongoing, this is obviously a fairly heated debate over this carbon tax issue between the provincial government and the federal government. We've seen consistently, going back to your predecessor in this province, some fairly heated rhetoric coming from Saskatchewan on this topic, and we saw it again today. You called it a scam and other things. What do you stand to gain in using such heated language in your defense against the carbon tax? Because we don't see that coming from the other side as much.
Well, I think the language that you have heard and you continue to hear is caused by disappointment. 5 minutes after the Prime Minister took the microphone today, the province of Saskatchewan received a call indicating that there is acceptance and acknowledgement of the impact of the Prairie Resilience Plan and what it would actually have on our environment, but explaining that they are also going to move forward. The federal government is going to move forward in taxing families across the province. We did not have any discussions prior to that, which is disappointing with respect to the relationship that we have most certainly. That is why you are going to see us continue to stand for the people of this province, to continue to move forward with good and solid environmental and economic policy, if you will. And that's acknowledged today by the federal government that a plan for prairie resilience is just that. But you are also going to see us ensure that we stand up for the families across this province when they are going to be taxed by that same federal government, taxed when they take their kids to the hockey arena, taxed when they take their kids to the dance hall, taxed when they heat their homes throughout the very cold winters that we have. The rhetoric that you have heard and will continue to hear are a function of the disappointment of the government of Saskatchewan in the relationship that we currently have with our federal government.